Okay, we have to talk. Do you see this? Pretty strong, right? And you know what? I'm even gonna show you the build for this right away. Yeah, the title was no exaggeration. Follie is absolutely beyond good and evil. And if you want to see what the lady can actually do with mods, well, then stay tuned. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members as always, and now, let's get right to it. However, before we get into the entire madness, let's quickly talk about how you can actually get your greedy little Tenno fingers onto Follie yourself. In order to even be able to farm her, you need to have the Chains of Harrow quest finished. That is what allows you to get into the mission in which you farm Follie. Once you have that though, all you gotta do is head over to the Vesper relay on your star chart, and that will then allow you to walk through this big painting and enter the Follie's Hunt game mode. That's the new game mode added with this update, and within it, you're gonna farm Follie. However, just like with most releases, if you get unlucky with the drops, then there is an alternative, because there's also a new resource called Atramentum, which you can take and bring to a new NPC called Zorba. You will find him on any relay, you see it in the background right here, and from Zorba, you can then also buy Follie's components from the new resource. And before we get into the skills and the builds and everything, there's just one more thing that I need to say here. It, of course, is release day today, so it might be that there are some bugs, issues, changes, fixes that are gonna happen after I upload this video, so I'm gonna try my best to keep you updated in the pinned comment. Just keep it in the back of your mind when watching. Alright, let's talk about Follie's abilities, as per usual starting out with the passive. And this one is pretty simple to explain, but it is also very, very good. See, Follie has a unique mechanic which is called Ink Blot. Every time you cast any of her abilities, you will cover enemies with ink. And the special thing about this is that enemies which are, let's say, inked, are going to be slowed by 50% for some time, and most importantly, when you take them out, there is a 20% chance to drop health and energy orbs. This right here alone is so incredibly good because it means you're gonna get showered in health, in energy. Just use equilibrium somewhere in your build and you will never ever run out of juice. It's ridiculous, and that's just the passive. Follie's first ability goes by the name Forced Perspective, and this one is essentially your panic button, your survivability, especially at higher levels. See, what happens here is actually pretty simple. When you press it, you will teleport to the location that you're currently aiming at. If there are any enemies nearby, then you will coat them in your ink, and this is the main feature about the skill, while you're in the casting animation, you're completely invulnerable, and even after the teleportation, you will continue to be absolutely 100% invincible for another 3 seconds. This has no cooldown, so you can theoretically just teleport left and right and stay invincible constantly. However, as if that's not good enough, there's an additional treat for us, and that is that on top of the invincibility, you also clear all negative status effects whenever you teleport. So yeah, this one is essentially infinite rolling guard, just without cooldown, and it's gonna be incredibly strong when you want to stay alive at higher levels, where you would usually have to rely on shield gating. Pause real quick, post-MHBlacky here. I just found out another little detail, and that is that your shields actually regenerate while you are in this invincibility mode, which means if you combine this skill with like any form of shield gating, you're literally 100% unkillable. Up next, let's actually skip the second skill for a bit, because this is by far the most complex skill probably in the entirety of the game, and we're gonna take some time later to explain it in detail. So for now, let's skip right over to her 3. What you do right here is you essentially create a clone of Follie. This clone then has an AoE around it, in which enemies when they enter it will get inked. On top of that, while you are in this AoE, you will get a damage reduction scaling up to a maximum of 90 whopping %. This can make Follie very, very tanky. However, the coolest thing about this skill is that it is kinda sorta a set and forget skill, because for every kill that you get, you will extend the duration of this skill, so you can kinda keep it on forever, but you will also increase the AoE in which enemies get inked, plus you also need to get kills to ramp up this damage reduction to its maximum of 90%. Long story short, this skill is very good because it makes you extremely tanky, it inks all the enemies around you, meaning you're gonna get showered in health and energy orbs, and what is also very cool, the maximum radius of this is incredibly big, so you can really cover the entire room with this and kinda sorta make up for the fact that it is a stationary ability. Oh yeah, and just for completion's sake, the more you charge this skill up, so to speak, the physically bigger and more impressive this Follie dummy will get. But that's just a visual effect. Follie's fourth ability goes by the name Plein, and this one is actually pretty interesting. When you tap the ability button, you attach balloons to all the enemies around you, which will then elevate them so that they're kinda stuck under the ceiling. Every enemy hit by this gets their defenses reduced, which means shields as well as armor, and this can scale up to a maximum of 100%. If I'm not mistaken, I think the full strip happens at 200% ability strength, so very manageable. Now, while the enemies are floating in the air, you can actually shoot the balloons to pop them, and when the enemies then fall down, they will take a whole bunch of fall damage, scaling with your ability strength. That's not all though. It's not actually just them who takes the damage, but this damage will also be dealt to other elevated enemies in a small area around them. The cool thing here is that this can kinda sorta create a chain reaction where the damage from one falling enemy might take out another enemy who's still hanging up in the air, and this way you step by step annihilate absolutely everybody who's currently hanging on a balloon. I think this ability is pretty funny, and I was very positively surprised when I saw that it only costs 75 energy to cast. You know, usually these ultimate fourth abilities always cost 100 energy and are very expensive, so I think what you get here for just 75 energy, that's actually a very good call. But alright, let's finally talk about her second ability. This one is gonna take some time, so make sure to get your snacks and drinks ready. Follie's second ability goes by the name Shadowgraph, and it is no exaggeration to say that the entire identity of this one Warframe is 100% just this second ability. The other ones that we just talked about, they are very good, they're nice supportive tools, good to have, but Follie's entire DNA is this skill right here. When you hold the second ability key, you will open a gear wheel of a total of 14 different creations that you can summon into the level. And if you thought that we're now going to go over all 14 in great detail, then you're absolutely correct. Let's go. The way I structured this is that some of these creations have a cooldown until they can be resummoned, but others can be spammed all day long. I now first want to go over with the ones that do have a cooldown, and after that we're going to talk about those who don't. First of all, Follie can summon a Thermia RPG. Everybody who has played Helminth already knows what this is. It's an RPG, you can pick it up, shoot it at enemies, and it does a lot of damage. The special thing about this is that the damage of the Thermia RPG scales with enemy level, so no matter who you're up against, it's always going to be very devastating. Downside here though is that you can only summon one every 30 seconds, so it's not like you're gonna spam explosions all day long. I personally think this summon is actually not really all that good, not because the damage isn't high or anything, but just as a bit of foreshadowing, some of the later items here are going to be so much better at doing exactly the same thing. However, one thing that I do have in mind, but I haven't had the time to test it yet, if you play the Helminth tank battle mission where you need to blow up the blast doors first and stuff, in those missions it might actually be a nice little tool to speed it up a bit, definitely something that I'm going to test out. The next summon would be Elemental Amphors. If you do this, then you will summon 3 amphors of random elements that you would usually only see in the Alchemy game mode. If you are playing Alchemy, then you can use these amphors to further the mission progress, and if not, you can still pick them up and throw them at enemies. Similarly to the RPG, they do scaling damage and they're usually pretty darn strong. Next, we have the Orokin Death Orb, and this one is actually pretty darn good. As the name suggests, you summon an Orokin Death Orb, which will spin around its own axis, shoot out lasers in all directions, and whenever these lasers hit an enemy, they will deal a bit of damage and inflict radiation status effect. The special thing here though is that unlike the normal Orokin lasers, which damage absolutely everything that gets into their way, these ones here are incapable of damaging you or your squad. I think that's pretty good, so you don't have to worry about using this on the field. Also here though, the Death Orb has a 30-second cooldown, but now we're gonna get into a feature that is pretty interesting about this skill. Whenever you summon one of these creations, the cooldown actually starts ticking down while the creation is still active on the field, not only after it has disappeared like with most other skills. What this means is that, for example, for this Death Orb with a 30-second cooldown, if you put enough ability duration on Follie that it has a 30-second uptime, that basically means you can keep it on the field constantly, and that is very, very nice. And also goes for all the other duration-based stuff. Stuff like, for example, the Loke Surge. This one is an item from the Zeraman 10-0, which, if you interact with it, gives you 1 out of 6 random buffs. I put you a list of all these buffs in the background right here. I'm not going to explain all too much about them right now because the video is already going to be very long. Just one important fact here, the infinite ammo and fire rate thing, that has been deactivated for the Loke Surge from this ability because it would be very, very overpowered in combination with the rocket launcher. Next, we have a couple more smaller stuff, for example a universal ammo case, don't think I have to explain all too much about that. There's also a launch pad for a bit of parkour, helps you to boost yourself into the air, and then there are 4 more mission-specific items that can help you further the mission progress a bit. For example, we can summon a life support capsule for survival missions. Then we can also summon a power cell for excavation missions. Also here, don't think it's all too crazy, but nice to have. There's a defense target dummy that you can put on the field to distract the enemies, and for disruption, you can also summon in a conduit key. All of these though, as you can also see in the bottom right corner, do have quite the cooldown, so they're just like nice to have little additions, they're not revolutionizing the entire mission type. Now, what does revolutionize the game quite a bit would be the next summons, because now we're gonna get into those that don't have cooldowns. And holy moly, DE, what did you do here? First of all, we have the barrel, one of my favorite summons. You create an explosive barrel on the field with 1 out of multiple possible elements. Whenever you shoot it or it takes damage, then it explodes, and because it is classified as an environmental hazard, it too scales with enemy level. You're always gonna deal absolutely devastating numbers. And the best thing about it, also here, you yourself are completely immune to the explosion damage. This is very, very good. You know, just spam barrels all over the place and everything blows up regardless of enemy defenses, enemy levels. It just doesn't matter. You just instantly kill everything and you can spam it all day long. However, you think that's ridiculous? Well, let's talk about the arc trap. Well, you can now spam these things all over the place too. And also here, their damage is level scaling. And if you group up enemies and throw one of these bad boys in there, then believe me, they're gonna deal some ridiculous numbers. They're not quite as explosive as the barrel, but also here, they're absolutely ridiculous. Then we also have the Lost Spirit. This one I'm not too big of a fan of, creates one of these Zeraman 10-0 spirits that shows you the path to some valuable item or something. It's okay, but if you have a landing craft with the Orokin Eye air support drop or something, that's usually the better way to go for. And then last but definitely not least, we have also the Coralizer, which is a very interesting tool because it is essentially like a turret that links to nearby enemies and it slows them down while inflicting them with constant cold status effects, which is effectively gonna freeze them. This is also very cool, especially for like defensive purposes. However, one thing that I'm not sure if it's intended or maybe a bug, if you freeze enemies with this, it actually does not trigger your Arcane Ice Storm. That's a little bit unfortunate. I hope that DE looks into that and maybe enables this synergy, because it would be really, really cool for Follie to use this. Last thing I want to mention with this second ability though is, all these icons that you see in the gear wheel for the ability, you can actually change them with custom images that you can paint in a literal paint-like editor in the game itself. I'm not gonna get too much into it right now because I can already feel my voice crack and we still have to talk about the builds and everything. Please though, don't paint anything that is against terms of service because you're gonna get yourself banned if you do. And as always, leave a like for the video because that would help me big time with the YouTube algorithm and it might repair my voice a little bit too. So thank you so much for the support. But okay, let's finally talk about the meat and potatoes of today's video, and that would of course be the builds. And before we do that, there is one more important thing that I want to say. As I'm sure you can imagine, with all the different things you can summon into the level, Follie is one of the most versatile Warframes in the game, and you can do so many things with her that it's basically impossible to have one ideal way to build her. So whatever you're gonna see in this video, this is only stuff that I came up with, and I would be very curious to hear your suggestions for potentially interesting synergies in the comments down below. With that being said though, given the fact that Follie is accessible relatively early in the game, or in the early mid-game so to speak after Chains of Harrow, I thought I want to start out this section with a more of a budget approach for a build, which would be this one right here. This here is what you're going to use if you're somewhere in the mid-game where you're just able to afford Follie. In this build, we go for a little bit of everything: Energy Siphon to give you more energy regeneration, Equilibrium for even more energy due to her passive, and then a healthy mix of everything, with Stretch and Augur Reach for more range. I think this is actually pretty important to give you more radius on your third ability and in general. But we also want to go for some duration with continuity so that your summons last a bit longer, as well as strength because strength is always nice to have. More maximum energy comes from flow, and our survivability comes from vitality as well as steel fiber. Follie has pretty good health and armor values, so we're going to get almost 70% damage reduction just from our armor. Plus, when we have our third skill on, we can get up to another 65% damage reduction from that. Unfortunately though, with just Intensify alone, we're not going to get the strength up to 200% to gain the maximum of 90% damage reduction here. But hey, you know, it's the mid-game build, it is what it is, it's good. But now let's go more into the Steel Path direction with the Steel Path builds, and as per usual, we're gonna start out talking about Helminth options as well as Archon shards. For Follie, when it comes to Helminth abilities, it's actually super easy to explain. You can literally do whatever you want. Given the fact that you have 14 different summons and so many different playstyles and potential synergies, there is a never-ending flow of options what you can do here, right? I'm not gonna recommend anything specific, you know which skills are generally good. The only thing that I will say is, if you want to make a build that focuses specifically on summoning explosive barrels, Thermia RPGs, or these electric arc traps that zap the enemies to death, then, in this case, and I know it's boring, but Roar is like your best option. This one right here not only increases the damage of all those summons to ridiculous extents, but in case of the Arc Trap for example, Roar is considered faction damage, Arc Traps deal damage over time with the electricity, so it's double dipping goodness. That's also the reason why on most of the builds that I'm going to show you today, this is going to be the subsume that I go for. And if you're by the way curious which Helminth ability Follie brings to the table, that would be her third. However, there is quite the downside here, which would be that it's capped at only 75% damage reduction, just like other damage reduction abilities too. However, unfortunately, the ink will also not be applied to enemies, so this is essentially just a worse version of Eclipse. As for which ability to replace with something from the Helminth, that actually comes down to which build you're going for. If you want to be tanky Follie with a lot of armor and a lot of damage reduction from your 3, then you can totally go and subsume it over your first if you think that this invulnerability time period and the status cleanse is not necessarily worth it for you. However, on the other side, if you want to go into very high levels where you're basically going to have to spam this all the time to stay alive, in that case, you can subsume it over your 4th ability, but obviously the 2, that's her main skill, right? You cannot subsume over it. And also the 3, I think the AoE is so big and the inking to the enemies is so valuable to give you health and energy that these 2 here are basically set in stone. Decide between your 1 and your 4, whichever you can do without. However, whoever says Helminth also needs to say Archon shards, and that is actually quite interesting with her. One thing that I would recommend definitely no matter which Follie build you go with is 2 yellow shards, if you have even 2 Tau Forged, into casting speed. This is very helpful. I feel a lot of her skills are just much smoother to play if you have a lot of casting speed. However, for the other 3 slots, you're basically free to do whatever you like. You could use blue ones for more maximum energy so you free up a flow mod space in your build. You can go for more ability duration, ability strength with your red shards. However, what I did, and this is actually pretty interesting, I went for 3 purples that give me more ability damage against enemies affected by electricity. The reason why I did this is because one of the builds that I'm going to show you later is specifically focused on these arc traps, you know, that zap the enemy with electricity, and the damage that you deal with those is so much higher if you use these shards, because these 10% that is actually multiplicative ability damage and therefore significantly increases your damage output. If you're not going to go for the arc traps though, then these 3 slots here are basically free for whatever you want. Let's though finally talk about the mods and the arcanes. In this video, I have 3 Steel Path builds prepared for you. The first one is more of an all-around build that doesn't even use a Helminth Subsume, and it's just made for a playstyle where you want to be able to use whatever Follie has in her arsenal without any restrictions. And then the other 2 builds are focused more on dealing a lot of damage, nuking the entire screen with Follie summons. But before I say too much, let's go into the all-round build first. This right here would be it. However, before you just blindly copy it, give me 1 minute to explain it because a lot of this here is actually pretty flexible. First of all, what we do need is primed flow for more maximum energy as well as equilibrium to always have all the energy in the world. Then, what I also highly recommend is going for a lot of range with her because it increases so much. It increases the ink range around you whenever you teleport with your 1, it increases the damaging radius and the overall balloon application radius from your 4, and, as you can see right here, with a lot of range, the ink radius from your 3 that you want to have up all the time goes up to a maximum of 50 meters. That is ridiculous. I think range is one of the most important stats on Follie. That's why we go for overextended, stretch, and even cunning drift, although I should say this one is a flexible slot. If you want to use something else in your Exilus, then by all means do that. These 15% don't make much of a difference. One more thing I also want to say for stretch is, you could use Archon Stretch because Archon Stretch gets triggered if you summon these electricity traps. However, I would decide how much you plan to use the traps, because if you need to add an additional forma just to be able to fit Archon Stretch, it might not really be worth the investment as you're already gaining so much energy from just equilibrium alone. What I did then is, I specifically added a lot more ability strength with Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify, Mold Augmented, and Arcane Impetus. This makes it that my 4 deals a lot of damage if I want to use it, and it also gets 100% defense reduction when all these buffs are up. Plus, I think no matter the build, you should always aim for 200% strength, as that will give you the maximum of 90% damage reduction here and the fully armor stripping right here. As for Arcane Impetus, this one is flexible, you don't have to use it on this build, but I found it was actually pretty cool because with all your summons, you can deal relatively many different elements to the enemy, and therefore you're gonna gain a substantial amount of stacks on this. However, when it comes to strength, there is one very important point that I need to hammer home, and that is that these elemental hazards that you can spawn in, the arc traps, the barrels, the Thermia RPG, all of that does not scale with your ability strength. It scales purely with enemy level, and if you want to increase the damage of those bad boys, you gotta use something like Roar to buff up the damage of the ability. Strength alone does not do anything for those skills. What I did here is actually pretty darn simple. We have a lot of armor, 52% damage reduction from that, we gain 90% damage reduction from this, and I added adaptation for another up to 90% damage reduction. And Prime Continuity was a nice last addition to gain some more ability duration. With 155% in specific, the Orokin Death Orb that applies radiation to enemies from your 2, that one will have 31% duration on a 30-second cooldown, so with Prime Continuity alone, you're gonna have constant uptime on that, and I think it's a cool tool to have. But okay, so much for the all-round build where you can really do whatever you like. Let's now though get into the, in my opinion, most fun build with her, and that would be the Zapper build. This one right here looks relatively similar, but as you can see, it goes for a lot of ability strength. Why is that if the Zapper doesn't scale with ability strength? Because I have Roar, and the Zapper scales with Roar, and Roar scales with ability strength. So the more strength I have, the stronger the Zapper gets. I also replaced Stretch with the Archon Stretch version, because with this build we're gonna spam specifically the Zapper a whole lot. However, the rest is relatively similar. I did take out Overextended because it was costing me too much strength, but still 160% range is nice. These Zappers are absolutely ridiculous with how much damage they deal if you throw them into a group of enemies. And just to drive this point home even more, if you want to play this Zapper type of playstyle, then absolutely as your secondary weapon, use the Scythed to group up the enemies and then throw a zapper into them. And then last but definitely, oh boy, definitely not least, let's talk about a secondary variation of this zapper build, where we're not going to use the zapper itself, but instead the explosive barrels. This right here is the boomer build, and oh man, it is also so freaking good. Now, with this one I did change a couple of mods. First of all, I swapped out the aura. It's still flexible, do whatever you want, but I took out growing power for corrosive projection, because this build right here is completely weaponless. We will not shoot a single bullet. Then I also replaced Archon Stretch with normal stretch again, because with this one, we're not necessarily going to use the zapper anymore, and therefore I inserted overextended to further increase my range so that I get a massive 47 meter ink radius on my 3. Now, also here, as a subsume we go for Roar, because Roar increases the damage of the explosive barrels, but in contrast to the Zapper build, we can do with a little bit less ability strength, because the barrels are so ridiculously strong they're going to one-hit everything anyway. Rest of the build though is relatively similar, we go for a lot of strength, a lot of range. Duration is not all that important anymore because we're mainly using the barrels, this value is mostly for the convenience of Roar. And also here, Arcane Impetus, I found it pretty interesting because it gives me strength and more efficiency so I can spam the skill more. But if you wanted to, you can literally replace this with anything you like. Just one thing I wanted to mention, Arcane Universal Fallout is a pretty good arcane if you need even more energy on her. I don't think it's necessary, but given the fact that you can spawn these Orokin Death Orbs that trigger radiation on the enemies, you can shower the battlefield in energy orbs with this one. And now also check out my Ultimate Warframe tier list 2026 right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondakani02, Scalabauza, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Tagas, Peter Sader, Boomia1, Mr. Gamesplay, Zave, Alwindai, Azengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everynade802, Gabriel Tevez, Yako Ivan Gonzalez, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully tomorrow already for the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.